Where Himalayan pink salt really comes from might surprise you. There is a small pink crystal sitting in millions of kitchens around the world right now, and almost everyone who owns it believes something about it that isn't quite true. Not a lie exactly, more like a story that got repeated so many times it became fact. You've probably picked up a bag of it, maybe even paid extra for it because the label made it sound ancient, pure, untouched by modern pollution, mined by hand from the highest mountains on Earth. And in a few minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly where this salt comes from, how old it actually is, why it's pink, and what happens when you compare the wellness claims stamped on the packaging to what's actually known about it. Some of what you find out is going to be more impressive than the marketing. Some of it is going to be a little less impressive. Stick with me, because by the end, you'll never look at that little grinder on your counter the same way again. Let's start with the name itself, because that's where this whole story quietly goes sideways. Himalayan pink salt is not, in fact, mined in the Himalayas. I want to say that clearly up front rather than save it for some big twist later, because the real twist isn't that one fact, it's everything underneath it. The salt comes almost entirely from one place, a mountain range in Pakistan called the Salt Range, which sits in the Punjab province. Hundreds of kilometers from the Himalayan peaks most of us picture when we hear that name. The two ranges are related in a geological family, tree sense, both products of the same tectonic collision, but they are not the same mountains. And the salt was never carried down from Everest or K2 or any of the peaks people imagine when they buy a bag of it. So why does everyone call it Himalayan salt? This is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the answer isn't a conspiracy or a scam in the way you might expect. It's a marketing decision that worked so well it eventually became the accepted name. The Salt Range sits in the foothills of the broader Himalayan mountain system, geographically and geologically connected to it, and at some point in the salt's commercial history, likely as it began moving into international wellness markets in the late 20th century, someone decided that Himalayan sounded a lot more evocative on a label than Punjab Salt Range Salt. It wasn't technically false, just generous with the geography. And it stuck so thoroughly that today most people, including plenty of people who sell it, genuinely believe it comes from inside the Himalayas themselves. Now, before you feel tricked, I want you to hold on to that feeling for a second, because the actual origin story of this salt is so much older and stranger than a mountain range that the marketing almost undersold it. To understand where this salt really comes from, we have to go back further than mountains, further back than almost anything you'll typically think about in a day. We have to go back to a sea that no longer exists. Hundreds of millions of years ago, long before there were mountains in this part of the world at all, a shallow ancient sea covered the region that is now Pakistan, India, and a huge swath of what we now call South Asia. Geologists generally place the formation of these salt deposits somewhere in the late Precambrian to early Cambrian period, which puts it in the neighborhood of 500 to 600 million years old, predating not just humans but most complex animal life on the planet over an enormous stretch of time. That sea evaporated in cycles, the way a puddle dries up in the sun, but on an almost incomprehensible scale, leaving behind thick layers of crystallized salt sealed beneath sediment. For hundreds of millions of years, that salt just sat there buried, doing nothing while the entire surface of the planet changed around it. Continents drifted, oceans opened and closed, and then somewhere around 50 million years ago, give or take, in a timeline that's still being refined by geologists, something enormous happened. The Indian tectonic plate, which had been drifting north for tens of millions of years, slammed into the Eurasian plate. That collision is the reason the Himalayas exist at all. It's still happening today, which is part of why the Himalayas are still slowly growing taller every year. And as that collision crumpled the Earth's crust upward into mountains, it also pushed up everything underneath it, including those ancient buried salt beds. The ground folded, lifted, and over an immense span of time, that prehistoric seafloor ended up exposed in mountain ridges instead of buried under an ocean. That is quite literally what you are tasting when you use this salt. You are tasting the floor of a sea that existed before the dinosaurs. I think that's worth sitting with for a second because it reframes the whole product. The marketing claim that this salt is ancient isn't an exaggeration. If anything, it's an understatement. Most things we call ancient in human terms, the pyramids, the first cities, even early human migration, are measured in thousands of years. This salt predates animal life walking on land. It was already old before anything resembling a dinosaur existed. So on that one specific point, the romantic version of the story and the scientific version actually agree. Now let's talk about the place where almost all of this salt actually gets pulled out of the ground because the mine itself has a story that's just as compelling as the geology. And it involves a detail you've probably heard before without realizing it was connected. The primary source is a place called the Khewra Salt Mine, located in that salt range I mentioned earlier. It is one of the oldest and largest salt mines on Earth, with tunnels stretching for many kilometers underground across multiple levels, some of which have been open and worked for well over a century in their current industrial form. There's a popular legend attached to its discovery that you've likely encountered somewhere without knowing where it came from. As the story goes, the mine was first noticed around 326 BCE, when Alexander the Great's army was passing through the region during his campaigns into South Asia. According to the legend, his soldiers noticed that their horses were licking the rocks in the area, and upon investigation, they discovered the rocks were salty. I want to be honest with you here. This is folklore, not documented historical fact, the kind of origin story that gets passed down because it's memorable. Not necessarily because there's a contemporary record confirming it happened exactly that way. But true or not, people have almost certainly been extracting salt from this region in some form for a very long time, with more formal, large-scale mining operations developing under various regional rulers and later expanding significantly under British colonial administration in the 19th century, when much of the mine's current tunnel system and infrastructure was developed. If you ever get the chance to see footage or visit in person, the inside of this mine looks less like an industrial site and more like something out of a fantasy film, because the salt has been carved and shaped over so many decades of mining. The walls glow with this deep rosy, amber-pink underlighting, and over the years, miners and engineers have actually carved structures directly out of the salt itself, including a mosque built almost entirely from salt bricks, illuminated walkways, and even small models and replicas carved from the mineral. It's become enough of a spectacle that it now functions as a tourist destination in its own right, drawing visitors who want to see what an underground seafloor from 500 million years ago actually looks like up close. So now you might be wondering about the elephant in the room, which is the color. If salt is just salt, sodium, and chlorine bonded together, why is this stuff pink instead of the bright white you get from a salt shaker at a diner? The answer is trace minerals, mainly iron oxide, the same compound responsible for rust, along with smaller amounts of other minerals trapped in the crystal structure when the salt formed all those hundreds of millions of years ago. As that ancient sea evaporated, it didn't just leave pure sodium chloride behind, it left behind sediment, clay, and mineral impurities mixed into the layers. Iron oxide, in particular, reflects light in a way that gives the salt that pink to reddish hue, and depending on the concentration and the specific mineral mix in any given section of the mine, you can get shades ranging from pale blush pink all the way to a deeper rust red. This is also, by the way, why salt isn't perfectly uniform in color even within the same product. You're looking at natural variation from a real geological deposit, not a manufactured dye. Here's where I want to pause and have an honest conversation with you, because this is the part of the story most videos and most product packaging tend to gloss over, and it's the part that actually matters most if you're the kind of person who cares about getting accurate information rather than just an interesting story. The marketing around this salt frequently makes health claims that it contains dozens of trace minerals your body needs, that it's somehow more nutritionally beneficial than ordinary table salt, that it can support things like hydration, mineral balance, or general wellness in ways regular salt can't. I want to walk through what's actually verifiable here, because you deserve a straight answer rather than either blind dismissal or blind hype. It is true that this salt contains trace minerals beyond sodium and chloride, things like potassium, magnesium, calcium, and that iron we just talked about, among many others depending on testing methods. Where the claims start to stretch beyond what the evidence supports is in the scale of those minerals. By weight, this salt is still roughly 97 to 98% sodium chloride, essentially identical in its core composition to ordinary table salt. The remaining trace minerals exist in such small quantities that, from a nutritional standpoint, you would need to consume an amount of salt that would be unhealthy in other ways, primarily from excess sodium intake, long before those trace minerals added up to any meaningful nutritional contribution. In other words, you're not going to get a meaningful dose of magnesium or potassium from seasoning your eggs with pink salt instead of white salt. Mainstream nutrition science generally treats all forms of salt as functionally similar from a health standpoint, with sodium intake being the primary factor that matters for things like blood pressure and cardiovascular health, regardless of which colorful rock it originally came from. None of this makes the product fraudulent or makes you foolish for owning it, to be clear. People are allowed to prefer how it looks, how it tastes, the slightly different texture and crunch, depending on how it's ground, or simply the story behind it. There's nothing wrong with enjoying a product because of its history rather than because of unproven health benefit. What I gently push back on is any claim, anywhere, that frames this salt as a health supplement or a meaningfully healthier alternative to other salts. The honest answer is that the appeal here is almost entirely about origin, aesthetics, and story, not about superior nutrition. And I think that's actually a more interesting thing to know than a vague, unverified health claim would be anyway. That distinction also explains something else you've probably noticed if you've shopped for this online or in stores, which is just how much bigger this has become as an industry over the last 15 to 20 years. What used to be a relatively obscure regional product became, somewhere in the 2000s and 2010s, a centerpiece of the global wellness and clean eating movement. Suddenly it wasn't just salt. It was salt lamps marketed as natural air purifiers and mood enhancers, despite there being no strong scientific evidence supporting meaningful air ionizing effects from a lamp made of rock salt with a light bulb inside it. It was spay treatments, bath soaks, even decorative slabs used for cooking and serving the same mineral that sat underground for 500 million years suddenly found itself reinvented as a lifestyle symbol. Sold at a significant premium compared to ordinary salt, largely on the strength of that ancient, exotic, mountain source story we've been unpacking this whole video. And if you step back from the specific subject of salt for a moment, I think there's a broader pattern here worth noticing because it shows up again and again across products, supplements, and trends. A product has a genuinely interesting, even remarkable origin story, in this case, quite literally being the floor of a prehistoric ocean pushed up by one of the most dramatic tectonic events in the planet's history. That true story gets simplified for marketing into something punchier. The mountain name gets borrowed even though it's not technically accurate, and somewhere along the way, unverified health claims get layered on top because ancient and exotic sounds like it should also mean healthier, even when the actual chemistry doesn't support that leap. The real story was already compelling enough on its own merits. It didn't need the exaggeration. That's true of a lot of things we buy, honestly. And I think it's a useful lens to carry with you the next time a product label tells you a story that sounds a little too perfectly designed to sell you something. If this kind of deep dive into the real story behind everyday objects is something you find interesting, this channel is going to have a lot more of it coming. And subscribing means you won't miss the next one. I'm not going to pretend. That's not a small ask in the middle of the video. But if you've made it this far, you're clearly the kind of person who actually cares about getting the full picture rather than the surface level version, and that's exactly who this channel is for. Let's bring this back to where we are right now, because the mine is still active today, still producing salt that gets shipped, processed, and packaged for kitchens and wellness shelves around the world, alongside its growing role as a tourist site for people who want to walk through those illuminated pink tunnels in person. The economics around it have shifted considerably from what they likely were 100 or even 50 years ago, when this was primarily a regional industrial resource. Now it sits at this strange intersection of heavy industry, geology, tourism, and global consumer wellness culture, all built on top of a deposit that has been sitting quietly underground since long before there were eyes on the planet to ever look at it. So where does that leave us with the question we started with? Where does Himalayan pink salt really come from? Not the Himalayas, not in the literal sense the name implies. It comes from a sea that existed before complex life crawled onto land, a sea that evaporated, got buried, sat untouched for roughly 500 million years, and then got violently shoved upward by the same tectonic collision that built the tallest mountain range on Earth, just not quite into those specific peaks. It comes from a mine in Pakistan's Salt Range that may or may not have first been discovered by soldiers watching their horses lick rocks over 2,000 years ago, and that today looks more like the set of a film than an industrial site. Its color comes from rust trapped in stone for longer than almost anything else you'll ever hold in your hand. And its reputation as a health product comes less from rigorous nutritional science and more from a very effective, very human tendency to associate ancient, exotic, and untouched with healthy, even when the actual chemistry mostly disagrees. I'd rather you walk away from this knowing the real story than the convenient one, because honestly, I think the real one is better. A piece of an ocean floor that predates the dinosaurs sitting in your kitchen cabinet right now. That's not a marketing line. That's just what it is. If you learned something from this, or if you already knew some of this and want to add to it, drop a comment. I genuinely read through them, and I'm curious how many of you already had a feeling the Himalaya name didn't quite add up before today. And if you want more videos like this, ones that take something sitting quietly in your everyday life and trace it all the way back to where it actually came from, make sure you're subscribed, because that's exactly the kind of story this channel is built around. Thanks for sticking with me through this one.